Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. As M said in Die Another Day, knowing who to trust is everything in this business. In this business of global finance and geoeconomics, do you trust the new MSDR? We haven't seen an SDR bond created since 1981. Until now. Will the dollar die another day? And are SDRs forever? I sense a bond theme here. Stacey.
Well, the MSDR is this new market SDR, which is a special drawing right that the IMF issues as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement back in post-World War II. And this is the first new bond that was issued in yuan in China, sold in China this past week. But, I want to, first look at the setup to the situation. So in Europe, and in America and other major central banks around the world, we've seen a lot of crazy happen. So, for example, the Swiss National Bank, it emerges, is now the 8th largest shareholder in Facebook, the Swiss National Bank. They own more shares than Mark Zuckerberg. He, of course, has more voting rights with his shares. We have the Bank of Japan buying up every ETF, shares all over markets around the world. They're going really crazy. And we have elections in the US, which are from another world. They're so crazy. But patiently, quietly, without calling attention to themselves, we see exactly what Keiser Report has said for years with our guests like Jim Rickards. He has said the special drawing right would be used to roll up all the debt in the world. It would become like a global currency. And this is what China wanted. And this is what we have. We have a few headlines on this. Here's one from Market Watch. And they think this new SDR, dollar status, won't be tarnished by sale of Chinese SDR bonds. So they're trying to tell people in America, don't worry, be calm. It doesn't mean the end of us. Well, the World Bank's forthcoming launch of $2.8 billion worth of bonds denominated in special drawing rights on the Chinese market is a further landmark step in China's long march to support the International Monetary Fund's composite accounting unit as a potential rival to the dollar. So from October 1st, the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, is part of the SDR basket. So it'll be 10% will be yuan.
The entrance to the abattoir is a windy road that goes back and forth. You don't want to scare the cows on their way to the slaughter. So people in the media, financial media, are telling folks, don't worry about the dollar, don't worry about the British pound, don't worry about the rise of the SDR and RMB and China, and they go through this windy road up to the abattoir, and then finally you get to the head of the abattoir and you lose your head because now you've lost your place as the world reserve currency, as Britain did basically after, World War I era, World War II, the U.S. took over. Now it's time for the U.S. to pass the baton over to basically a consortium led by SDRs, IMF, China, and the New World Order, as some have called it.
This SDR was actually what John Maynard Keynes wanted originally for a global reserve currency. It's basically a unit of account, as they point out in that article there in MarketWatch. It's a unit of account. It's not a currency per se. It's like the original blockchain in a way. It was in order to avoid all these trade imbalances that we now have. China itself does not want the yuan or the renminbi. They want it to be internationalized. They do not want the reserve currency because to have a reserve currency, you have to be a big debtor like the U.S. has. They don't want that. But as this headline says, from Reuters, CNBC, Chinese investors uninspired by World Bank landmark SDR bond auction. This is because the yield is extremely low. It's well under 1%. I think it would be the first bond issuance ever in China to be under 1%. Inclusion in the SDR, however, was seen as a major diplomatic victory for Beijing, which is trying to increase the global stature of its currency for use in trade and as a reserve currency. But the victory is largely symbolic so long as SDR bonds remain lightly used. IMF data shows that SDR holdings made up only 3.24% of global actual official currency reserves at the end of 2014. No official yield range has been published for the bond issuance, and no final dates for their sale has been set either. So investors in Beijing were a bit lukewarm on it, but they will not allow the auction intended to support the internationalization of the currency fail for lack of demand. So the Chinese government was going to step in to make sure that whatever happened, that the bonds were all bought up.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point that it's a global currency that would facilitate transactions globally, but it is nevertheless issued by a central bank, the IMF, and who has come under lots of scrutiny over the past 10, 15 years for playing favorites, and their role with the Troika in Greece and in other places in Europe has been not, as very honest. So they are subject to the same problems you have with other central banks. That's my point.
Well, there's a lot of panic in the West, and do something, buy up Facebook shares, buy up ETFs, do something. And people think like something's being done. I think China's not panicking. They're sitting there calmly. They see what's going to happen. They know that there's only so much fraud, so much leverage, so much debt you can pile upon a small little base of economic activity. So it's not like a hostile act. They just know that the dollar is going to fail. It's inevitable. The mathematics of it do not work. So they're getting ready patiently. And they are going to be, they always say he who has the most gold rules. Well, China has the most gold, but they're also buying up the SDRs, as Jim Rickards had said when we last interviewed him before Summer Solutions, is that they'll have all these SDRs. They have them in their economy. They have them there now, the billions in new SDRs issued, market SDRs. So for them, on the surface, in the short term, and remember, we only think short term over on this side of the world, short term, it doesn't make any sense because, these Chinese banks will have to pay the bondholders in strong currencies like the dollar or the euro and take the weak currency, the yuan. So, however, in a longer term plan, if they're thinking long term and strategically, this could be like owning the gold.
Well, clearly this is the direction they're going in. And now it's starting to play out on the world stage as folks that have been talking about on the show for a few years.
Speaking of guests on our show who have been talking that for a few years, we have Jim Rickards, and he's quoted in this article from Valentin Schmidt, who we also interviewed from the Epoch Times, talking about China and this new SDR, the MSDR. What China's SDR bond issue really means, this is the first step toward one world currency. They promised, they deliver. The World Bank will issue this new $2.8 billion bond. The current governor of the People's Bank of China, he says, Zhao Zhiwan, has advocated for the SDR to become the next global reserve currency for a long time now. Quote, special consideration should be given to giving the SDR a greater role. The SDR has the features and potential to act as a super sovereign reserve currency, wrote Zhu in 2009. He also wanted the yuan to be included in the SDR, which is going to happen on October 1st. Take heed of his predictions. So again, we have in private hands, in these private banks and in private investors are building up these SDRs in China. They are, they look like loser bets at the moment, but on a long-term strategic plan, we could see what's happening there.
Right. Well, the composition of the SDR, and we get into this in the interview that comes after the break, the representation of the Chinese currency is 10% in that basket, which represents the SDR. Now, contrast that with the index of the foreign exchange market, where the Chinese currency is just barely in the top 20 of most actively traded currencies. This would put them in the top 5, probably, which would be an enormous leap forward. So the central planners, over there in China, when it comes to figuring out how they want to architect the global financial markets over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, seem to be playing a pretty shrewd game.
Yeah, also, the capital flight has stopped. Remember, they started last year with $4 trillion in foreign reserves, and that fell to $3.2 trillion, a huge drop. And now that's steadied, and this is in order to try to keep some of that capital flight from happening. But also, back to this article from the Epoch Times, they say that now that the first issuance is well underway, remember the first issuance, they're probably going to be second and third and fourth. It is easy to lever up the balance sheets of international development organizations and keep issuing or printing SDR obligations, even in the trillions, until even private market actors support and accept them. Once the SDR is widely accepted as payment, the IMF could just redeem all outstanding local currencies for SDR, and the world would not only have a new reserve currency, but just one global currency. Quote, you create new liquidity. That's the kind of reform that could change the international system immediately. This is
right. So you had the banks in crisis in 2008. The central banks are in crisis in 2016, 2017. So to bail out the central banks now, they create the SDR, so they're going to have to create $100 trillion worth of SDR.
Yeah, that's what they said at Davos at the beginning. Remember, 2009, it's still in the early stages of the global financial collapse, and we were a year into it, then still panic, and these, we were a few months into it, and at Davos, I think it was Soros who was saying we need $100 trillion.
Yeah, $100 trillion credit facility, SDR-based, IMF working the books to roll up the bad debts. So you take all those bad debts that are owned by the central banks, and as they become full up and their balance sheets can't buy any more of this garbage from the banks, they then sell it to the IMF in exchange for SDRs. So you have a whole nother chapter coming in monetization lunacy yet to be played out, which means, okay, these paper assets could go a lot higher. You know, the stock market, the Dow Jones, which is flirting with 20,000, it could go to 40,000. Facebook stock, instead of being worth 300 or 400 billion, could be worth $800 billion.
So the Swiss National Bank may make a lot of money out of
Apple Computer could be worth over $1 trillion, you know, shortly, because you've got now $100 trillion of fresh capital that was just birthed into existence by pushing a few buttons to bail out the central banks, who in 2008 bailed out the commercial banks.
Yeah, but it also seems like when the People's Bank of China is able to operate on a longer term sort of horizon than our central banks and governments here, where we all are so trained to be short-term thinkers and think of that quarter, how much your house price rose that month or that quarter. And it just seems like this is bad news for all of us ADHD sort of tweeting 140 characters. That's all we can think of at a time, sort of in that quarter's profit margin. So it just seems like bad news, and we predicted it.
Yeah, well, we can't think about the first or second quarter of this show. We have to think about the third and fourth quarter, which is coming up after the break. So stay tuned for the second half, or the third and fourth quarter of this show. A whole lot more.
Я Денис Тарасов, мне 23 года, я занимаюсь плаванием. Я родился с поражением опорно-двигательного аппарата. Конечно, бывает иногда, когда все болит, все ломит. Спорт для меня просто не представляю смысла жизни без спорта. Что может быть лучше паралимпийских или олимпийских игр? Это не передать словами, когда ты просто выигрываешь и в честь тебя гимн играет. Может, кто-то нас посмотрит и одумается, чтобы соперники боролись с равными. Мы готовы работать, тренироваться, выиграть все медали. А если нас не допустят, то я буду готовиться к Токио. И там же держитесь.
Has America changed?
Of course.
It's been 15 years since 9/11.
Oh my God!
But terrorism is still there.
Why do they hate us? Why do we have so many enemies? Is it too late to stop that?
What do you think about sanctions?
Easy right or wrong, but I definitely think sanctions are better than conflict.
You don't perform for diplomatic reasons. You perform for humanitarian ways.
I'm talking obviously about Edward Snowden.
I believe he's a hero. I believe he's coming directly from his heart.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. From quantum satellites being launched to new SDRs being issued, much has been happening in China this summer. So time now to go to Shanghai and speak with Dan Collins of the ChinaMoneyReport.com. Dan, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max. Good to be back.
All right, Dan, the People's Bank of China, in a report released last month, used the term yuan internationalization. Tell us about the significance of the statement. What does it mean in practical terms, Dan?
Well, the internationalization of the Chinese yuan, or the RMB, has been in process now at least 3 years. I think we've talked about it on the show before. China has currency swap agreements now with most major countries around the world, especially the developed markets. There's countries around the world like Argentina, Nigeria, Mongolia. They're keeping Chinese RMB as a reserve currency in their central banks. So China's pushing their trade into RMB. They're pushing their oil purchases into RMB. One of the things I've written about before is the petro-yuan, how global oil flows will become put into RMB as soon as the RMB is internationalized. And then the news we saw today was China working with the World Bank on the SDR bonds.
Okay, let's talk about the SDR, special drawing rights, for a second. So in other words, a few years ago, people were saying, oh, the yuan, the Chinese currency, is going to become the new world reserve currency as America and the dollar lose out, becoming the top dog of global finance. But a lot of folks, yourself included, said, no, wait a minute. They don't want to have a world reserve currency because there's actually a lot of problems with having a world reserve currency. You've got to keep a lot of the currency on hand, which is a risk. They'd rather get involved with the special drawing right, which is issued by the International Monetary Fund. And that's exactly what they've done. They've successfully argued to have the Chinese currency represented to a greater significance in the SDR, which is a basket currency. And I guess what I'm hearing now is that now they're cutting deals to make that currency will be more readily used. So can you just talk about the strategy here and a little bit more, Dan?
Sure. I mean, as you pointed out, having the global reserve currency can be a positive and can be total negative. If you look at America's manufacturing base, it's been largely depleted as everyone has depressed their currencies against the world reserve currency, which is the U.S. dollar. That's the exact reason China doesn't want to be the #1 world reserve currency. What they've done with the SDR bonds is, as you mentioned, October 1st, the SDR basket will go to 10% RMB. It's made up of US dollar, euro, yen, and pounds. The euro will lose a lot of share in the new basket to the Chinese RMB, which will be 10%, which is quite significant. That's higher than the Japanese yen share, which is 8%. But in addition to the renminbi becoming part of this major basket, this SDR basket, they've also worked with the World Bank this week to sell bonds. The first time in 35 years, the World Bank has sold SDR bonds. These were set up for Chinese investors. They sold roughly $2.8 billion worth, very low yields on the bonds, 0.4%. So the future doesn't look real bright for the bonds, but it is a major first step for the World Bank trying to create and put a new world currency on steroids, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, look at the numbers here. So if you look at the foreign exchange market around the world, #1 most traded is U.S. dollar. In the top 5, you've got the Japanese yen. You've got the British pound is up there because a lot of currencies clear through the British pound. The Chinese yuan was not even in the top 5. But now if it's got 10% of this basket, this is a whole paradigm-busting new world order, Dan, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Chinese, I think, was at 17 on that list at one time because it wasn't a convertible currency, despite being the world's largest economy on a PPP basis, world's largest trading nation, world's largest exports, world's largest creditor. Their currency was at number 17 in the rankings. So this was seen as even an embarrassment to the highest officials here. So this SDR bonds, this is part of this that's going to rocket the Chinese RMB up into the top, probably the top 2 currencies I expect in the world. I believe it'll pass the euro at some point and compete with the dollar.
And it suggests it's going to pass the Japanese yen. I mean, there's no love lost between these two countries. Is there a bit of a competition going on there, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Japanese are and should be paranoid of the military expansion in the South China Sea, East China Sea. However, economically, how does Japan compete with China? China has 20 times the population and is still a very dynamic economy on the upswing. Japan will have a lower share in this new SDR basket. Their Asian Development Bank, which was run by the Japanese, is now being countered by the Chinese Asian Investment Bank, which is going to be 2 to 3 times as large. They're building the one road initiatives over to Europe. I mean, there's literally a rail now goes right to Poland in 2 weeks, cargo rail. So I mean, yeah, China is expanding all over the region, over the continent, and it does have Japan and others worried.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about this Chinese currency now versus the Japanese currency. You've got the SDR, which is becoming a huge part of the global financial system now. Folks that are critical of the central banks around the world, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, who say that their ability to buy bonds from themselves, so-called quantitative easing, or in the case of Japan, buying stocks outright in the open market, has reached a limit. However, yourself and folks like Jim Rickards have suggested that, well, if the IMF and the special drawing right, which is the currency of the IMF, a central bank, if that becomes a $100 trillion credit facility, then you've got a lot of room yet to go with central banks buying up assets around the world, with China involved now, and this idea that the central banks have hit the buffers, that they have run out of runway, so to speak, in terms of what they can expand their balance sheets. What are your thoughts on this idea, Dan, that the IMF could create a $100 trillion credit facility, buy up all the junk, no good debt from the central banks around the world, roll it up into a huge roll-up, all priced in special drawing rights? I mean, it sounds fantastical, but a lot of people are talking about it. What do you think?
That, at the end of the day, that may have to be the global backstop, because we are in an era of globally coordinated debasement of everybody's currency. The first time in the world where everybody has globally coordinated to completely debase their currencies, and the Japanese are leading the way. I mean, their government owns half the stock market, half the JGBs now. I mean, it's just getting ludicrous. And at some point, you know, the levees are going to break, and then what's going to be there to backstop it? This might be the plan that they have in place to try to do that.
Now, let's move on. So China has launched a quantum satellite into orbit. Tell us about it. What does this tell us about China as a rising power, Dan?
Well, this is interesting because this is making all of the science and tech magazines, newspapers, web, blogs, everywhere, all across the world, not getting so much major mainstream press in the West. However, this really could be kind of a new Sputnik moment as compared to when the Soviet Union launched the satellite that sent the U.S. Clearly showed we were behind in the communications space. The new quantum technology with the satellite is out to prove new photon communication. It's really the next generation over, you know, we went through the old Newtonian physics to the digital revolution, analog, digital, and now we're moving into quantum. China is leading the way. It's not, before I talk about the satellite, it's not new. China, highly underestimated in science and technology. They have the world's fastest supercomputer, twice as fast as the U.S. fastest supercomputer. They came out, they didn't settle there. This year they came out with a new supercomputer at the Taihu Computing Center that's now 3 times as fast as the current world supercomputer. Now they're number one. It's 5 times as fast as anything the U.S. has. Though they have pushed the envelope of the processors, it's using a complete Chinese operating system, Chinese processors. They have pushed the envelope there. They're now moving into the quantum communication with the idea of this to become a globally unhackable internet. That's the concept. If you can create a quantum communication system, it will be unhackable and it will be 100 times faster than the current digital communication system. This satellite is going to communicate with 2 bases between China, around 1,200 kilometers apart, and it's really to prove long-term, high-speed quantum communication. It's not their only project. They also have a Beijing-Shanghai link with a new communication system that will be completely unhackable. And a lot of this new technology has been spurned by the revelations that came out with Snowden and all of the NSA and U.S. tech collaboration, U.S. tech and NSA collaboration that's been going out of the States. So China's really trying to push the envelope here into new quantum computing and quantum communication.
So while the FBI is trying to get Apple to open up a back door to their mobile phone technology, China is leapfrogging everybody, coming out with quantum satellite technology that will blow everyone else out of the water.
Yeah, and the interesting thing to note is that not only will your systems be completely defensible in quantum computing, but everyone's old digital systems will be completely open. You could completely open them within a matter of hours, as opposed to 100 years, based on today on what the world's fastest supercomputers could do. So really, this is this is the next revolution. It's been proven in the laboratories. Now China's taken that step to prove it in space with long-distance quantum communication.
All right, so finally, China is sending troops and/or support for the Russian mission in Syria. Uh-oh, sounds like World War. Dan, what's going on?
Well, it reminds me like as a kid, we're heading back towards a new Cold War. The People's National Congress here a few days ago passed a law stating that Chinese counterterrorism forces can now operate outside of China. The Chinese aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, has been spotted docked in a port in Syria. The rumors are that over 5,000 Chinese troops are going to be put into Syria. They're coming out of Siberia, so-called Siberian Tiger Force, elite counter-terrorist force. They're going to join the already large Russian forces that are there, which a lot of people don't realize. Russia has 4,000 troops there, attack helicopters, fighter jets. So I think this is good news for the world. Maybe we can stabilize the Syrian situation finally, instead of continuing to support rebels trying to overthrow the government and causing all this death and chaos.
Right. I mean, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it's been active for years. There's been huge cooperation between these two. There's a lot going on. No one seems to pay attention to it, even though it looks like the building block on which you have a new world order being based.
Yeah, and keep in mind, too, this is to get Chinese troops experience. They're now going to be in Syria, but you'll probably see them in East Africa. You could see them in the Caribbean. You could see them in South America. You could see them everywhere in a few years. And keep in mind, the Chinese have said that this is a response to what the United States is doing in the South China Sea. So they're saying, you're going to play in our backyard, we're going to play in your traditional spheres of influence areas. So really, the world map could be completely redrawn here in the next few years, geopolitically.
All right, Dan, we got to go. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks a lot, Max.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Dan Collins of the ChinaMoneyReport.com. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.